Well, welcome back. This is the 7th of 7 videos looking at Chapter 8 in Wheeler's most excellent book on security risk management. What we're going to do is look at risk mitigation from a different perspective. And so we're looking at an additional reading. This additional reading is going to explore the idea of security risk mitigation, but do it from a different perspective based on obstacles and trust assumptions. So first of all, it starts with this idea that we need to maintain the confidentiality, integrity, availability, and authentication of systems. Now, authentication is the author's different word for accountability. So it's the same thing, though. It's still a CIAA model. An obstacle is going to be something that obstructs one of those security goals from being achieved, and that there are trust assumptions that are made by the development team using use cases. And we're going to explore this using a student and a lecturer as an example later on in this particular video. So as you want to think about this overarching idea that you have goals of CIAA around security, there are obstacles that to those goals that can be caused when a trust assumption becomes invalid or they're obstructed by an obstacle. So that's the kind of overarching idea here. So let's kind of walk through and see how this actually works. Now, to do this, we're going to look at some of the assumptions that underlie those that trust. Some of those are going to be load bearing. And if this happens just like a building, if the load bearing is compromised, it has severe consequences for the building. And if a load bearing assumption is compromised with relation to trust, it has severe consequences. There are also some things that relate to being vulnerable. And again, if that happens, the trust relationship or trust assumption becomes invalid. And finally, there are misuse cases. What things could someone do based on a security threat? So their idea of a security obstacle mitigation model is going to be this lightweight approach. We're going to develop trustworthy systems. It's based on confidentiality, integrity, availability, and authentication. And we're going to mitigate obstacles that obstruct load-bearing, vulnerable trust assumptions. All right, so that's the premise for the paper. I think you've got all the vocabulary that goes with it. We've got one more concept to introduce, but it's not a hard concept. So here are those definitions. The new concept, if you will, is that one down in the bottom, that RAG code, which is a red, amber, green. It's a traffic light. And we're going to use this to rank the ability for a load-bearing and vulnerability of a trust assumption. Okay? And so let's look at this graphically. This leads to, as we're comparing that load-bearing assumption against a particular vulnerability, that red, amber, green ranking on each one of the load-bearing and the vulnerability. And as you can see, the most challenging cases were red in both. We've got red in a load-bearing assumption and a vulnerability. All right, well, this all looks good theoretically. Let's actually go in and look at how this particular works at a conceptual level. Then we're getting into a very explicit example that the article talks about. So we're working with that kind of purplish top part of the chart. We're going to start off by eliciting user cases and list and prioritize those user cases. And to do that from a kind of programmatic perspective, we're going to get the user case from a list. We're going to list and rank trust assumptions associated with it. And then we're going to have some ranking mechanism to disregard what we perceive to be insignificant trust assumptions. All right, and that's all going to be based on our load-bearing and vulnerability, red, amber, green code pair associated with doing that kind of ranking. From there, notice the purple component of the graphic shifted, and we're now down and looking at listing those significant trust assumptions, getting that from a list, and then defining what obstacles, and that's a recurring step, what obstacles might be in the way of that trust assumption. Okay? And again, this is just a programmatic way of doing it. We're going to shift, if you will, that purple chart and now look at, okay, fine. Now we need to get the obstacle cases, outline what mitigations address those obstacle cases, select the most effective mitigation or set of mitigations, and then define a mitigation step. And again, you may be saying, well, this all looks good in graphical form and in concept, but how do you apply this? So that's what we're going to do. We're actually going to go through, and in this case, build a series of objects that interact. And so we have a lecturer interacting with the student, and the lecturer can log in, upgrade the grades, enter the grades, and create a view of all the students. The student can come in and look at their grades, and they can log in as well. And you can see those as use cases down in that second chart, and you can see that the trust assumption associated with that use case. So now we're beginning to see how this theory translates into practice. So we've got a use case of a lecturer logging in, and there's a trust assumption that the password and user identity will not be compromised. The confidentiality of that password and identity will be maintained. When they're entering in the grades, that the integrity of that information will be maintained because it's only being entered by the lecturer. And not only is there an integrity there, but there is a authentication component associated with that as well, that we have accountability back to who actually did it. So, again, you can see the user cases and the trust assumptions and the series of objects of how this all relates together. All right, so let's explore this a little bit more. So now we kind of see what a use case looks like and a trust assumption looks like, but now we've got to do an evaluation of those trust assumptions against our load-bearing assumption, our vulnerability assumptions that affect our trust assumption. All right, and as you can see, we've done that using that red, amber, and green ranking system. That's what the RAG stands for in the particular table. And again, you can see those trust assumptions where we've mapped it into those. And then what we've got in the second chart is, again, we've taken those trust assumptions, at least a subset of them, the first four, and then mapped them against obstacles. All right, so what would be an obstacle to the password and user identity not being revealed? Well, it could be a brute force attack, could be a traffic analysis attack. How about being entered by someone else, a masquerade attack? So again, you get where those particular obstacles occur in that trust assumption. From there, again, we've got an obstacle case now, that brute force attack, masquerade attack, and traffic analysis attack. And then we're looking at, well, all right, well, what mitigation steps would we put in? Well, we could put in a firewall. We could use public key encryption, and we could look at the access attempts to detect when that brute force password attack was actually occurring. And so that brings this all together in terms of being modeled, and that's what the users did. They modeled this using object-oriented code to identify these obstacles, mitigations, trust assumptions, the load bearing, and to make a full system and create a new mechanism or a new view of looking at how you do security mitigation. All right, well, very good. Guess what? This brings us to the end of Chapter 8. We had 3 additional readings associated with this, but we looked at risk decisions, looked at documentation of risk decisions, looked at risk mitigation planning and policy exceptions, and then from there moved into some exceptional or additional readings on the CIS 20 controls, board actions, and then a new model for looking at security risk mitigation. All right, well, next lesson we're going to get into one of our underlying frameworks, audit responses, knowledge management, and artifacts associated with this whole process. So this finishes Chapter 8. Keep on studying, keep on learning. I look forward to seeing you in the next video when we explore Chapter 9 of Wheeler's most excellent book, Security Risk Management.